episode 1 of Bird's Nest Astrology Podcast. I'm Arthur.
I'm Nate.
I'm Margaret.
We are recording at 1:25 p.m. on January 20th, 2019 in New York City, New York.
Arthur, I gotta cut in. You said bird's nest instead of bird's eye.
Nest.
Bird's nest? Oh my God. Bird's eye. We'll leave that one in.
Okay.
Bird's eye. Guys,
Perfect.
I have not had enough sleep.
It's okay.
Bird's eye is
because you were
about
toiling away at
I was
preparing for this
toiling away,
podcast.
exactly, in the astrology minds.
Yeah.
Yes.
So why don't we tell folks a little about ourselves? Margaret, do you want to go first?
Sure. All right. I have a fairly diverse background as far as astrology goes. I remember the specific time that I started studying astrology. I was about 7 or 8 years old. If any of you remember those scholastic book orders you used to get in school.
Oh, I love those.
Remember those?
Yeah.
They had the little kits in the back, and I got the personality kit or whatever, and it was palm reading and numerology, and astrology was in there. And I didn't put that book down ever. I always had it with me, and I loved it so much. So then anytime I could get a hold of an astrology book, I've been buying them up. So I've been reading, studying astrology for about 20 years. I started practicing and having clients about 8 years ago-ish. So I've been doing it for quite a while. I do a lot of relationships and history readings, and I've been studying draconic charts in my extra special time.
Yeah, we'll have to get you to talk more about draconics.
Oh, yeah.
Draconic charts more
that.
in a future episode.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to hear.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I'm Arthur. I have been studying astrology also since I was 8 or 9. Both of my parents were big in the pagan occult communities, so I learned a lot about various topics from them and various occult stuff. I didn't really learn astrology from them, but there were astrology books in the home growing up. I was obsessed with Linda Goodman when I was 8, 9, 10 years old. And I studied it until I was about 15, and then I don't remember why. I just stopped. A lot of stuff going on in my life at 15 years old. Picked it up again, I want to say about 5-6 years ago, around 2012, 2013, and just been diving into it, grabbing up everything I can ever since. I've also been reading tarot professionally. I started out doing readings for clients when I was 12. Just designed a deck of cards on my own, not a full tarot deck, but based on astrology symbols, worked with that until I was 17 and then switched to tarot, and have done pretty well for myself as a tarot reader. I was featured in BuzzFeed a couple of years ago. I want to say 2017, I was on Kotaku's live stream doing tarot readings.
Cool.
And been wanting to do more astrology professionally and personally for the past year or two. Not that I wasn't doing it already, but just sort of shifting the focus.
Mm-hmm.
Nate,
Cool.
you're up.
I'm Nate, and I have a pretty eclectic background. The first astrology book I was ever given I was a little kid, and my best friend's mom got me the book, The Secret Language of Birthdays. And I was,
yeah.
and I didn't really understand what was behind what I was reading, but it got me hooked on astrology, and I kept it pretty private for many years. And I have a strong background as an artist in theater and performance art, and I work as a professional storyteller. And so my way into actually conceiving of what it would be like to go public with astrology was when I started apprenticing with a company that combined the study of archetypal psychology, rooted in James Hillman and post-Jungian archetypal psychologists, with performance art. And after that, a series of events, kind of this domino effect. I met a master Jungian astrologer in New York called Montgomery Taylor, and I immersed myself pretty intensively in a one-on-one apprenticeship with him, and started teaching myself or, studying ancient techniques, and now studying more in the traditional, the revival of different strands of traditional astrology, Hellenistic astrology, Neoplatonism, and started having professionally clients about 3 years ago now. So the public aspect of it is still pretty much in its infancy for me, but it's very exciting. And I'm also very influenced by psychomagic with Hodorowski. So that's kind of another reference point that I bring in and use with clients a lot, that can be pretty fun and playful and get astrology out of the head.
Yeah, I can't count the number of parties I've been at in Brooklyn where somebody is playing Alejandro Jodorowsky on a projector somewhere.
Yeah.
Both Nate and I live in New York City. Margaret, you're in Milwaukee?
Yep, I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Bit of a difference there.
Bit of a difference. Yeah, you can kind of hear it in my voice. I'm sure you will in the future.
Yeah, so just for this first episode, Nate and I are recording in person, but in spite of living in the same city, we're like an hour away from each other. So future episodes, you won't see I'm not sure. We're going to try and have video for this. If we do, you'll see Nate and I next to each other. So I think the plan for today is to talk about, since this is going to be theoretically released at the end of January, to be talking about the month ahead, astrology for February.
Woo. Sounds good.
Yeah, at first it doesn't seem like there's a lot going on because there's no major retrogrades, there's no eclipses. But we were going through it in the prep, and there is some interesting stuff going on. You want to go through it in order, or anything in particular we want to start with?
I feel like the order is a pretty solid story, rock opera type thing.
Yeah.
Like if we begin at the start beginning, hitting each other. I like
definitely, yeah, it would be in the rock opera vein.
Yes.
February, the rock opera.
Okay, that's going to be the title of the episode.
Yes. The rock opera of February.
Nailed it.
Feb rock opera. All right. We do start off with a bang, too.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, February 1st, we've got Mars square Pluto. Which that's an exciting aspect.
Now, do we want to maybe go a little bit over what a transit aspect is as opposed to a natal one? For our listeners who might not know the difference.
It's a great point, Margaret.
Thank you. So when you've got an aspect going on by transit, it is what the planets are doing with each other in the sky at a given moment. Like, for example, later on in the month, we'll talk about it. There'll be Venus conjoined Saturn. And if you look up in the sky at that night, you will see Venus right next to Saturn. Whereas with a birth chart, what you're looking at is what those planets were doing, what that sky looked like at the moment you were born. And transits tend to be transitory. As long as the aspect is going on in the sky, there's that effect. It's in the air. It's influencing what's going on in people's lives. Whereas an aspect in a birth chart, you've got that for life.
Right. And then the aspect in the sky will affect aspects in your own chart as well.
Yeah, exactly. I like to call it the space weather.
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
So basically we're doing a weather forecast, a space weather forecast.
Space weather forecast, exactly.
Space weather, yeah. I like it.
Anyway, so when you've got stuff going on in your natal chart that's similar to what's going on in the transit, you're going to feel it a lot more. So on the first, we've got Mars square Pluto by transit. So if in your natal chart you have Mars and Pluto in an aspect with each other, particularly if it's a hard aspect, square, conjunction, opposition, then you're going to feel it a lot more.
Right.
One thing I also recommend paying attention to is what are the ruling planets of your sun, moon, and rising sign. I use traditional rulers. I don't know where you're at with that, Nate, but I'm very much of...
I use both.
Okay.
I kind of switch.
I use both as well.
Okay.
Why don't we give a little summary of what that is? Like, what's that mean?
Basically, each sign has a planet that rules it. Aries is ruled by Mars. Taurus by Venus, Gemini, Mercury, Cancer, Moon, Leo, Sun, Virgo, Mercury, Libra, Venus, Scorpio, Mars, Sagittarius, Jupiter, Capricorn, and Aquarius by Saturn, and Pisces, Jupiter.
In a traditional
sense. Now, astrology is older than the telescope. So Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto weren't discovered until a few hundred years ago, whereas astrology is thousands of years old. So when they were discovered, they were added into the rulership scheme with Uranus ruling Aquarius, Pluto ruling Scorpio, and Neptune ruling Pisces.
Right.
I have a bit of a philosophical issue with that, which is that the Uranus, Neptune, and Pisces are invisible. You look up at the sky, you can't see them, which makes it, from my perspective, it's very difficult to rule a sign if you can't see what's going on with it.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I have noticed there is a resonance. There's definitely a lot in common especially between Neptune and Pisces. So the affinity is there.
Right.
Yeah, but the philosophical discussion of the difference between rulership and affinity and modern and traditional
that could be a whole episode.
That's extensive. I would encourage us to break down those different philosophical issues, the ones that are most exciting and timely for us, and have future episodes about those topics.
Oh, absolutely. I just wanted to make sure the listeners knew what traditional versus modern is, because sometimes it's a little funky to understand.
I'm a little jargony.
Yeah.
Just
jargony.
As a person.
Yeah, I mean, it's great stuff.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Mars is the ruler of Aries. It's the traditional ruler of Scorpio, and Pluto rules Scorpio as well. So Mars square Pluto, you're going to feel a lot more if your sun, moon, or rising sign is Aries or Scorpio. So Nate, or Margaret, do one of you want to talk a little bit about Mars square Pluto as a transit?
Well, I personally natally don't deal with it as much, so it's a little more difficult for me to relate to it as a transit, but I immediately think angst. like energetic. So like if you go outside and you're driving to work and you're running late, you might be a little angrier than normal. You might be a little more stressed out. But
I have it natally. I have natally Mars square Pluto.
Okay.
Yeah.
Better suited then.
Yeah. So it's fine. I mean, I think that it can be can be dramatic, but in a more interiorized, brooding sort of way, depending on what else you have going on. It's a kind of darkened, growling drive that's trying to come out, but that's often on the Pluto side being reined in. It's like Mars has this drive and a lot of energy.
Right.
It could be sexual, it could be all these different sorts of vigorous things, but it's often reined in by Pluto that's trying to kind of keep everything behind the curtain and veil.
And the square is I'm hesitant to say hard or difficult. But I always relate the square to two people trying to fit through a door frame at the same time.
Yeah.
I love that image.
The energy, it's applying, but it's like taking your fingers and trying to push them together. Like you're feeling it all throughout, even your arms and all the way up to your shoulders. Like it's an interaction. There are similarities between the two things that are interacting at the time, but they might not be going in the same direction. Maybe this hand's trying to go this way and this hand's trying to go this way, and they're just in each other's way, and they're applying to each other in a way that might be stressful. Your arms are sore if you try to do that for a really long time.
Absolutely. Mars is passion and will and drive. It's very like kind of
right.
It's aggressive. It's passionate. It's focused. It's fierce.
Mm-hmm.
And Mars, which is why it's associated with both rage and sex.
Right.
And why it's easy to switch from one to the other, especially when Pluto is involved.
Oh, yeah.
Pluto makes everything a little dark, a little underworld, it can be very obsessive.
Yeah.
And it can be very secretive. When you've got Mars, and I often find like people with a natal Mars-Pluto aspect, even if it's a flowing, easy aspect, like a trine, very often there's a BDSM component to the sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not accusing you of anything unless you want to share.
Arthur, it's the first episode.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to chime in. I have the trine. So
all right,
I think we all have the kind of the Mars-Pluto going
We all
on.
have the Mars-Pluto aspect.
In a way.
Sorry.
Right.
But no, because there is that element of the sexuality that wants to go really, really intense when you've got Mars and Pluto.
Yeah.
It turns up the volume on everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not enough to fuck. It needs to, pound.
Right. Devour.
Or have some kind
yeah.
of dark fantasy component to it.
Right.
Yeah, it can be,
A noir element.
Pardon?
A noir element.
Yeah.
Noir. Yeah, it's not necessarily the pain mixed with the pleasure. There can be the dark, there can be like the noir, there can be the, like, what did you say? The dark fantasy?
Dark fantasy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It can be something. I think it can be either physically complex or it can be psychologically complex or both.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it can definitely be obsessive.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
anything. So yeah, around the first, that sort of intense, with the obsessiveness and the anger and the lust, that's going to come up for people.
Also, I just want to say, because we're talking about squares, we're talking about Mars square Pluto. Margaret, you started talking about the stressful aspect of a square, I think. And some squares can be like a wall and a ceiling where there's actually support. It needs that sharp angle in order to manifest or in order to be the actual support that is needed for something. So it kind of,
I read in a book once, the old saying where people who have sun square moon are like the most motivated, successful people because they're constantly just like driving up the ladder because they're being supported all the time.
Without friction, there is no movement.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So a chart that has all easy aspects, whether transit or natal, doesn't mean that your life's going to be, all sunshine and roses all the time. It's just, growth is a necessary thing.
Yeah. I mean, but also like I found that if you've got a natal chart that's almost entirely easy aspects, it's very difficult for that person to just get moving and do stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like you don't want things to be too easy.
Yeah.
Right.
So what's up next on our list? Venus enters
Capricorn. Yeah.
Venus enters Capricorn on the 3rd.
So for our listeners who might not know, what's the difference between like Mars and Pluto being square and Venus entering a new sign?
So the aspect is sort of how the planet is playing with who else is on the field.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if the planets are the actors in a play, then the aspects are what those actors are, how those actors are interacting with each other.
Right.
What's the drama going on between them?
Space theater.
Yeah, space theater. Space theater weather.
And choreography. Yeah.
And choreography.
Yeah.
Space dance.
Yeah. Are these two characters flirting? Are they fighting? Are they, tied at the hip?
Right.
Whereas the sign that a planet's in is sort of like, what's my motivation?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that character doing what it's doing? And what are the tools it has in order to do that?
I love the theater astrology analogy. It's like my favorite thing. Glad we went right into it immediately. It's so easy to explain.
The book Planets in Play.
I have it sitting right behind me on my bookshelf. I love that book.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost like the transit. This is not a perfect metaphor, but another way to look at it is sort of like the transit is what is that planet doing and what is that planet doing and who's it doing it to? Whereas the sign it's in is how is it doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like imagine also thinking of the sign as an environment can be helpful too. I think like imagine that you're Venus and you're doing your aesthetic, beautiful thing.
Yeah, Venus, aesthetic, beauty, love, relating.
Yeah, and then you spend a week in, you spend a week in Siberia, and then the next week you go to Hawaii. It's like that's sort of what entering a new sign could be like.
Yeah. Or like the weather changes and you change your coat. Like suddenly you need, your goose down winter jacket, and then you might go somewhere else and you might need to wear different clothes and express yourself differently depending on where you're at.
Exactly.
So yeah.
So in Capricorn, I mean, Capricorn is I just had a tweet get way too popular making a dumb joke about Capricorn. I'm on Twitter all the time, and like I will tweet super interesting like educational content sometimes and get like 2 likes, and then I shit post and it blows up. But so Capricorn is about ambition. Like one of the the biggest keyword I would use, and there's a few, but one of the biggest ideas for Capricorn is ambition. Capricorn wants to go from point A to point B up the mountain. And it almost doesn't matter to Capricorn what that mountain is. Mm-hmm. Stereotypical Capricorn is like the business owner, the CEO. But sometimes a planet in Capricorn just wants to be the best damn partier in the world.
Right.
I used to know someone who had a bunch of planets in Capricorn and lived her life appearing to do everything she could to embody the manic pixie dream girl.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have a friend who's obsessed with who's so many planets in Capricorn is obsessed with how present they are in any situation. Like,
right. Gotta be the most present.
Am I present enough? Oh no, I'm not present.
Because it's about fully achieving that archetype.
Yeah.
Right.
I
know someone with a multitude of planets in Cap in the 4th, and they're obsessed with being like the best mother ever.
Yeah.
Like you gotta be,
So I mean, yeah, it's not always obsessive, but it is driven.
It's driven, right? That's a better word for it.
Yeah. So Venus in Capricorn wants to relate, but wants to know what the agenda is. Why are we having this connection? What purpose does it serve? Does this piece of art I'm hanging in my home reflect the kind of person I want to be seen as by guests? Does this relationship, where it's sort of like where are we going in this relationship?
Mm-hmm.
Like and it's also, you'll find a lot of models with Venus in Capricorn, because it's about using the beauty for business, using the beauty to achieve a goal.
Right.
And I mean, I noticed that anecdotally. I haven't done the math on it or anything.
Yeah.
But,
you could also see that as appearing a certain way in order to, more loosely, like embodying a certain archetype in order to further your career / benefits that others may bring to you, or your lot in life, your station.
I feel like when we talk about career in astrology, we're not actually talking about career and how most people think of it.
Right.
Like whenever career comes up, it's more like
station in life,
your goal orientation.
Yeah.
Yeah, your life mission, or your mission, your sense of mission in life. Yeah.
I want to face it. Well, it's not necessarily lifelong.
No, it's not. It can be plural. It can be multiple. It can change.
Like I had a client recently who had Uranus conjunct the midheaven, and I told her, "Look, you're just always going to be changing careers every couple of years. Get used to it.
Right.
Embrace it.
Yeah, embrace it.
So with a Venus in Capricorn, it's like the beauty, the aesthetic, the relation is serving a long-term goal. And Venus tends to be very prominent in the charts of artists because that's all about that beauty and aesthetic. So if you are involved in the arts at all, or just do art for fun, Venus in Capricorn is a good time to get serious about your projects,
Yeah. Also, if we can bring Venus down to a human level, I think, in terms of thinking about our relationships, and not just our romantic relationships, but how we relate to people in our lives, how we relate to close people. And there's a sort of there's been a sort of story going on with Venus, at least in my mind, over the last few months, where we had a Venus retrograde. I'm going to go slow at this because it's a lot of information, but we had Venus retrograde in the fall. So when a planet goes retrograde, its power is sort of interiorized and working a lot on the internal psychic levels.
Right.
And so we had Venus retrograde between Scorpio and Libra. And so we were working on all this kind of deep, dark, and also kind of symmetrical, person-to-person, relationship-oriented stuff, even if we weren't necessarily in romantic relationships at that time, but relationships overall. And I think it was really, I think around, like, if you think back to October, November, that those months, it was very painful for a lot of people. Like, I heard a lot about relationships breaking up during that time, even relationships that seemed to have a strong foundation to them, because they were going through this kind of like dark alchemy of the Venus retrograde.
Right.
Yeah.
You also know a lot of very Venusian people because you're connected to all these artists.
Yes,
right.
That's true too. But even the non-artist folk. That's a good point, though. But that after that, now we having Venus in Sagittarius, we kind of hopefully we get this sort of this kind of blooming of optimism to go forward and do the work that's necessary. So like through the retrograde in Scorpio, it's like, oh, I'm discovering all this crap that's coming up to the
surface. It's bubbling up to the surface,
Bubbling up, yeah. All this work.
I don't even know it was there.
Yeah. All this work that needs to be done. And Sagittarius now, it's like,
but you can do it.
I can see the space.
But you can do it.
I can see that we can work with this. And now it's like Venus going into Capricorn. All right, do the work.
Right.
Yeah. So Venus has been in Capricorn for most of January. Sorry, Venus has been in Sagittarius for most of January.
Yeah.
And so the shift from Sagittarius to Capricorn is an interesting one, especially because Venus spent so long in Scorpio before she was in Sagittarius, and Scorpio is dark and grimy and underworld. No offense to Scorpios, nothing wrong with some dark, grimy underworld.
Grimy.
Yeah, I'm into it. But but that's not an easy place for the planet of love and beauty to be.
Right.
And then Venus went into Sagittarius in early January.
Yeah.
While Jupiter's in Sagittarius, and she's like, all right, time to relax, time to let my hair down, time to party. Venus is a lot of what we do for pleasure. Venus is as much a part of sex as Mars is.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the reason, well, I don't get into that now. But then if moving from Sagittarius into Capricorn in February, it's the party shuts down and it's time to get back to work.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, okay, it's like Sagittarius has this welcome break for Venus in terms of just, I can breathe. My heart feels lighter now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, now you've had that break.
Now we got to do the work.
Yeah, now what are you doing? Your relationship is, like if you had an intimate partnership, or like not even necessarily a romantic relationship, but like a important friendship or partner or whatever. And it's like, it was really challenged over the fall and into December. And then in January, it's like, okay, now things are easier. Now we can breathe. And then Venus goes into Capricorn in February, and it's like, okay, back to actually work, because relationships are work.
Yes.
Right. I mean, you get this unburdening through Sag. Sag has this deep-rooted but lighthearted optimism about it. So, Venus might have been, it's bubbling, as Nate was talking about, it's bubbling to the surface, and you might feel like it was really heavy. And then in Sag, it can be like, okay, so I'm unburdening a bit, and then Cap, you can give it some direction, like we were saying before, like the mission. I know what I want to do now, so I can do it, and the execution.
Yeah. And it is a much more serious Venus.
Yes.
Right.
Especially because Saturn's there in Capricorn too.
I know some Venus Capricorn people who are the most sensually embodied dancers, actually, like sensually embodied earthy dancers.
The form of Capricorn.
Yeah.
Like
the form.
The fine tuning is, beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And and it's not, Capricorn's earthy. It's grounded, it's physical.
Yes.
But people with Venus in Capricorn, Like they like your friends, they're professional dancers.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
movement coaches because they understand
Right.
the formal container, the formal technique.
Yeah.
Yeah,
get
technique. Technique.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, like
Mhm.
Venus in Pisces or Mars in Pisces is just going to dance because it's fun to dance and it feels good. You know, Venus in Capricorn is going to be like, okay, we're going to make money dancing, which means we're going to be really, really good at it.
Yeah.
Or even if they're not financially ambitious, it's like we're going to connect dance to something that
There's a purpose.
something that seems to matter. Yeah, right. There's a purpose. To
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
There's and whatever that purpose is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I do want to mention that this sort of Venus moving through Capricorn will affect you most if your sun, moon, or rising sign is Taurus or Libra.
Yeah.
Oh.
I always do that with my weekly astro weather. So
good call.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then right the very next day, we've got the new moon in Aquarius.
Yeah.
So let me actually pull up the chart for that so we can take a look at this bad boy. So one of the best things about this new moon is that it's the end of eclipse season.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a couple of eclipses in January, and generally, like, there's a portal around eclipses extending to half a lunar cycle on either end, but basically about 2 weeks. And so once that cycle is over, then you get out of that portal. Eclipse season is just weird.
Ooh.
Like, everybody I know has been having really weird dreams all month this January when they've been sleeping.
They've been sleeping at all, right?
Yeah,
They've been sleeping at all, yeah.
yeah. We'll get to that. One of the good things about Venus moving into Capricorn is that January has, and just to go back to that for a moment, January has had so many planets in fire signs that there's just been so much energy all over the place. Caitlin Koeppel, actually, lovely astrologer and colleague of mine, pointed this out on Twitter that, people aren't sleeping because there's so many planets in fire signs right now. Mm-hmm. This month, January. We're recording this in January. But in February, things start to shift and it'll be a little less intense in terms of all this energy all this time. All right, so if we get this video going, we've got the chart pulled up for the new moon. And it's at 15 degrees of Aquarius, right smack dab in the middle. Pretty close to Mercury, and not making a ton of other aspects. Oh, one thing, actually, no, that's interesting. So one of the major outer planet transits going on throughout 2019 is we've got Saturn sextile to Neptune. And this new moon is right in the middle of that.
Yeah, it's bisecting that.
Yeah, it is right at the midpoint. Exactly. Saturn at 15 Capricorn, Neptune at 15 Pisces, and the new moon is right there at 15 Aquarius.
Yep.
How would you interpret that, Nate?
Well, I'm continuing to feel the interplay of Saturn, the sometimes constrictor or the disciplinarian, and sometimes even in certain cases the jailer, and Uranus, the wild card and the liberator. And
right.
These two co-rulers, depending on what system you use, is co-rulers of Aquarius, that there's always an Aquarian interplay of walking the tightrope between constriction and liberation, between being limited, feeling your boundaries, and being able to kind of break through the boxes and expand outward. And I guess my interpretation would have to do with what I've observed as an actually heavily figured Uranus into our eclipse season, going through this whole, this past eclipse season we've had, but also going through the eclipse seasons of 2019. There are very strong Aquarian themes to everything. So I think what I can see at first blush is just a sense of feeling that tension really strongly, of feeling limitations and wanting to break out of them, or needing to confront our limitations in certain ways. And asking, okay, do I really need to conceive of these limitations the way that I'm thinking about them right now? Or are my limitations defined by the way that I kind of conceive of the box in the first place? What is the box? What principles define and shape the boxes that I create for myself in life? So that's kind of my first go at it.
Very good points there. I'm more drawn to the Saturn-Neptune thing rather than the Saturn-Uranus. Especially because Saturn and Neptune are very different planets, Saturn sets rules and limitations and strict, solid boundaries.
Yeah.
Saturn builds walls. And Neptune says, oh, there's no boundaries. Everything's all one. It's all dispersed. And here, have another 10 drinks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very diffuse.
It's very diffuse. People with a lot of Neptune aspects have difficulty setting boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because it's just like, what's a boundary? So and I think part of how we got to where we are, just in terms of the larger culture, particularly in the United States, was everything that went on politically in 2016, which was a large part of the Saturn-Neptune square that was going on then.
Mm-hmm.
There was just, everywhere I looked in 2016, there was a sense of, I don't even know what's real anymore.
Yeah.
and
yeah.
Needless conflict and bickering and petty infighting and people acting uncharacteristically obnoxious.
Yeah.
Just everyone. I was certainly doing it. There was drama in every community I heard anything about that year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a very tumultuous year for everybody, regardless of the topic.
And I blame the Saturn-Neptune square for a lot of that. But here we've got Saturn and Neptune in sextile. Sextile is a flowing aspect. Things tend to go easily. It's not as strong as a trine, but there's a sort of like, okay, I got you. You do you. You do you. Cool. Where instead of like this massive conflict between the need for boundaries and the need for no boundaries, it's almost like the coexistence of opposites.
Right.
Like, what's that? Never mind. I'm not going to mention that Simpsons joke on the air.
Why not?
No, it's only so politically inappropriate I'm willing to go on this.
Fair enough.
If you want more than that, find me on Twitter. But no, it's almost like, some people are going to and I think part of what that looks like is, especially because Neptune has this aspect of like higher spirituality, of just resonance with the universal one and all, or phrases that sound like that. Saturn is bringing some structure to that, some consistency, yes, you're going to take this serious long-term spiritual path where you just, explode your own head, figuratively speaking. But how are you going to feed yourself while you're in the ashram?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And those sorts of questions of structure versus either wanting to chill out or wanting to, disassociate or wanting to unify with the universe, which looks a lot like disassociation if you're not careful.
Right.
This sort of, okay, it's working, but there is some tension there.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a sextile, but they're very different archetypes.
Very different. And you're triggering, Margaret, you go ahead.
Oh, no, you're fine.
No, but I just wanted to say this new moon is really triggering that tension and that relationship between Saturn and Neptune.
But
I really like midpoint. I mean, I really like midpoints. Yeah, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as like in these sorts of instances where I like the term outletting. So if the sun and the moon are sitting in the middle, it's almost like, because the sun, is the self, and the moon is the emotional, without rising, those are the luminaries, they're very important. So it's almost like there's a person standing exactly in the hinge of like a seesaw, where one side is Saturn in Cap, holding all these really restrictive, for our own good. Of course, Saturn's always for our own good. But these restrictive tendencies, and Neptune's on the other side, being like, be diffuse, let go, connect. but the sun moon is sitting right in the middle. So I would almost say that it's providing balance. Balance, again, is a buzzword. I'm hesitant to throw balance around like, my weight or whatever. But
I think it's perfectly appropriate in this.
It's almost like holding out your arms and standing in the very middle of a seesaw and letting the energy from both kind of like you're holding two chains on the side and you're harnessing that, and you're letting that go. So new moons are always interesting as far as that goes, but I think that the exactitude of the degrees at which this is happening make it a very interesting, different sort of situation. It's almost like I said, like outletting, like your lightning rod for both of these guys, kind of channeling into you and letting it go out through your fingertips.
Yes.
Drastic arm movements,
And, yeah.
But I like it. I think it's interesting.
Yeah. I'm gonna add a little twist on this because you're both triggering another perception in me, which is that we must remember that Neptune, Poseidon, is also an earth shaker. So,
of course.
Even though, and you're both, I think you're both right, but also even though there's a sextile, I'm picking up on some earth shaker vibes in this new moon, because Saturn, the earth, can be, it cannot, we tend to think of, I think the archetype of Neptune as conceived in astrology is, we very often focus on the sort of dissolving, spiritual, sort of transcendentally compassionate aspect or diluted aspect of it, but it's also, it actually can be quite tumultuous at the same time. I mean, when we think of earthquakes and how tumultuous earthquakes are. And the reason why I'm picking up on that is also because although the new moon is not directly aspecting Mars and Uranus, this is again hinging on what system you use, but I'm going back to, the moon in Aquarius linking to Uranus in Aries, because Uranus ruling the new moon, the Uranus and that like wild card, that liberator that gives that push outward. And then Mars being at home in its own sign of Aries. Which is this again, this like Mars, this vigorous, dry, starting things sort of energy. So I'm feeling also with this new moon, there could be balance. There could also be a strong sense of push and shaking things, despite the lovely sextile aspects going on, because Mars and Uranus are kind of there. Even though it seems that the other planets aren't necessarily looking at them straight on, they're still kind of like holding the funds for a lot of things that are going on with this lunation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm also being drawn towards the sextile between the new moon and Jupiter. And it's pretty close to Mercury too. So with the Jupiter in Sagittarius, that's the spiritual component of Neptune is emphasized there. And with Mercury, Mercury analyzes and plans. So one thing I'm just thinking of, everybody talks about as new moons as times to make beginnings, and not necessarily major beginnings, but just, start something. Not every new moon is good for that. Solar eclipses generally aren't, for example. And there's new moons later in this year, which I would not recommend.
That Sagittarius a couple months ago was another example of one where it was not the moon.
That was
that was hard.
This one I think is particularly good in terms of like giving. If you're involved in any sort of spiritual path and you want to help figure out a structure to it, starting some sort of structure around your spiritual goals. This is a good new moon for that.
I'm inclined to agree.
The closeness to Mercury also gives it for, especially if you want to do any sort of just laying the groundwork in a notebook of just like figuring out what your plans are.
Yeah, just laying it out. Give it some bullet points maybe, or buzzwords.
Make yourself a PowerPoint.
Headers. Make yourself a PowerPoint.
Because Jupiter's also trining Mars, so there's also that energy of the go ahead, the release. Like you can do it.
Absolutely.
Confidence. Yeah.
Excellent.
All right.
Yeah.
What's the next thing we got on the menu?
We've also got Mercury going into Pisces.
On the 10th. Yeah. So we skip ahead a few days. Pisces is not a great place for Mercury. Mercury struggles in Pisces. No offense.
We could say it doesn't have as many resources.
It has a hard time
that.
doing what Mercury wants to do.
Yeah.
Mercury wants to communicate. Pisces is a mute sign. Mercury wants to sort everything into nice, neat, little organized piles. Pisces throws all of its clothes on the bed.
Mercury is discursive, and Pisces, very verbal, and Pisces is intuitive, going beyond words,
It never fails. Because I'm also like Nate does it professionally, but I do storytelling as well because I live in Wisconsin. So I go to Madison, and there's Madison Story Slam, really cool event. They have a podcast and stuff too. But it never fails. Whenever Mercury goes into Pisces, I feel this bizarre compulsion to write poems. So I have like this massive volume of poetry that I only write like once a year, and then I like don't really feel compelled to write for the rest of the year, and then it comes back around, and I just every time I love it.
Yeah, there's a lot of poets with Mercury and Pisces because it's using words without using words.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like finding meaning in words that isn't natural, that isn't automatically there.
Mm-hmm.
Using words to evoke what is beyond words. Yeah,
exactly. But there's a difference between again, we're going back to the difference between the natal and the transit.
Right.
When you've got natal Mercury in Pisces, you've got that your whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can have a lot of struggles around communication and using your voice with Mercury and Pisces when you're younger. But planets in the sign of their detriment or fall, which is a sign the planet doesn't usually do so well in, you tend to get better at doing that planet as you get older. You tend to learn how to work with it. So Mercury and Pisces, a lot of poets, but also a lot of people who struggle to use their voice until their first Saturn return or a little after.
Right.
But in transit, you don't have as much time to adjust.
Right.
No. Yeah.
So if you can already rock, if you can already rock the way Pisces rocks, then you can work with Mercury and Pisces. But if you're all Gemini and Virgo, which is what the planets ruled by Mercury, there's going to be a lot of dispersion. There's going to be a lot of difficulty being as analytical and as organized as usually comes naturally to those signs.
Right.
Yeah. And as the listeners of this podcast may know, one of the amazing things about astrology is that it offers a way to look at different things that are going on in the world. And I'm just thinking about how when the different things over the last few months that have involved gasoline in the world, and how Neptune, so Neptune, again, we're back to Neptune, Poseidon, the earth shaker, also the spiritual ruling gasoline, or being sort of the being the correspondent, mythic figure to gasoline because of distillation,
and it's a slippery liquid.
Indeed. So now we had when Neptune went direct after being retrograde. It's like, Neptune making this kind of surge comeback in November. We had all of these. We had in France the Yellow Vest protesters, which centered around gasoline and diesel. So these kind of like Neptunian events going on, these Pisces Neptune events. And then we also, just recently, there have been these gasoline related explosions in Mexico. So I'm just thinking about the way that we can track, different planetary movements through world events and through world news.
Absolutely. And Mercury because Mercury being the messenger deity, they tend to you tend to hear about whatever Mercury is doing.
Yeah.
Whatever planets, whatever signs Mercury touches, you're going to hear about it. So just what people are talking about is going to have a lot more to do with Pisces, including what's going on with Neptune. But but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves because Mercury we'll get to that.
Yeah, it'll take a while to really get close to Neptune, but it's way there. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
we'll get to that. In the meantime, we've got Valentine's Day.
Oh, yes.
So on February 13th, Mars conjoins Uranus. And then the very next day, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, Mars enters Taurus. And this is one of the first things that stood out to me about the month.
Yeah, that's hefty.
Well, I mean, it's the day of romance and love, and Mars is entering a Venus-ruled sign.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So Mars struggles in Taurus because Mars wants to be aggressive and focused and move and go. And Taurus wants to very, very slowly take its time and stop and smell the flowers and maybe deliberately arrange a bouquet of those flowers that it stops
Right.
to smell.
right.
Right.
Mars likes to initiate things. And Mars likes to initiate and start the new season. And Taurus, as a fixed sign, wants to go deeper, even if it's low.
Oh, now. Yeah.
There, Muhammad Ali had Mars in Taurus.
Mm-hmm.
But what he did was he completely changed the game in boxing. And what was the phrase he's most known for? Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this athlete who's talking about punching people for a living by talking about butterflies.
Right.
That's
of
Mars
course. Yeah.
No. And Mars, all for Aries and Scorpios, or people with the sun, moon, or rising, or other in Aries and Scorpio, Mars is super important in terms of like the fuel in the tank.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, every sign's ruling planet is the fuel in that sign's tank. So Gemini and Virgo have a harder time doing Gemini and Virgo things, while Mercury is in Pisces. Aries and Scorpio have a harder time doing Aries and Scorpio things, while Mars is in Taurus.
Right. Exactly.
So just be mindful that when a planet is going into the sign of its fall or detriment and it rules a bunch of important stuff in your chart, the fuel is not, it's going to be, speaking of gasoline, I didn't even do that intentionally.
I thought you did.
It's going to be hard to make the engine go.
Right.
But because Mars is an engine, it's especially true for Mars ruled signs.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Mars went into Aries on New Year's Eve.
Right.
So all of January and the first half of February, you've got Mars in a sign where it's very Marsy. It's very like, go, 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 move, 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 get it done, attack, or fuck, or
right, fight,
do the thing.
Yeah.
Not a lot of staying power in Aries, though.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And Taurus has staying power.
Yeah, not a lot of like, what's the long term of this, right? But Taurus, yeah.
So one thing that happens a lot is that it's an old cliche that people resolve to go to the gym for their New Year's resolution.
Right.
And I think that's something you especially expect this year with Mars going into Aries on New Year's Eve.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've kept up that going to the gym thing, you might hit a wall around the 14th.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden it's like, ugh.
Yeah, screech to a halt.
Yeah, or more like you're running, and then all of a sudden, instead of running through air, you're running through molasses.
Yeah. Ugh.
Yeah.
So it's a test of staying power. Not just going to the gym, but whatever you're doing that requires a lot of energy, particularly for people with Aries and Scorpio stuff. When Mars goes into Taurus, it's going to be the test to see, can you keep this up? Can you keep going until you catch a second wind?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
I would also encourage people, in terms of the conjunction with Uranus, to think about, for the partial solar eclipse that we had on January 6th, I think it was, Uranus went direct within 24 hours of that eclipse.
Yeah.
So there was this kind of electrification, this kind of electrifying energy, which may have made us feel that we're kind of pushed into a further kind of social outlets for our ideals, we might say, or social outlets for what goals or wishes that we have.
Right.
And so I just encourage people to pay attention to during this Mars-Uranus conjunction of if you have an opportunity to go to kind of harness a push forward towards your desires on a social level or on a kind of like community level, that there could be an opportunity to do that during this time, a brief window. But it's kind of like, if it's a kind of undercurrent theme since that solar eclipse on the 6th of January, that this might be a kind of hurrah for that to happen on the 13th. Yeah.
One of the keywords I use for I like what you said there, Nate. One of the keywords I use for Uranus is lightning bolt.
Yeah.
And combined with Mars, that can go in a lot of different directions.
Yeah.
Where Mars in aspect with Pluto will sort of dig in and twist.
Yeah.
Mars in aspect with Uranus is sort of almost like a crossbow bolt.
Yeah.
So if you've got a lot of planets in Aries and Scorpio, just be mindful of your temper on that day. It can just be so easy to get real pissed off real quick when you've got Mars in aspect with Uranus.
And around Valentine's Day, especially.
Valentine's Day, yeah.
Gotta keep that in mind,
Yes,
yeah, absolutely. Right. But it can also just be like a sudden burst of energy and movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But having that right before Mars enters Taurus, on a practical level, what that might look like is losing your energy when Mars enters Taurus because you went too hard the day before.
Yeah, kind of like being hungover.
It could be in terms of partying. If you've got Aries as your 5th house, totally could be in terms of partying.
I'm being silly. It's just like, there's always repercussions if you go too hard the night before, like doing anything.
That's what she said.
Oh, first one. How long did that take? Took about over an hour. I love it. This is great.
Almost exactly an hour before I said.
I'm thinking, what would, just as a kind of final bit, what would this? Oh, go ahead. You were going to finish saying something.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I keep meaning to mention this. What strikes me about it being Valentine's Day is that Mars is entering Venus's territory. Mm-hmm. So we've talked so far about signs sort of being like the room that the planet is in.
Yep.
And that room has got certain tools with which that planet can either do what it likes to do or struggle to do what it likes to do.
Right.
But there's also a room, and that room is affected by who walks into the room. Mm-hmm. So Taurus is going to be affected by having Mars there. Mm-hmm. So all the Venusian stuff, particularly the physical, the sensual, the earthy, the embodied sort of Venusian stuff around pleasure and aesthetic and, connection and value. Value is another important keyword for both Venus and Taurus. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, Mars enters the Venus's room on Valentine's Day. And that can either be a damn good time in bed, or it can be, why are we fighting? I thought this relationship was perfect.
Yeah, especially with the day before Mars-Uranus action, it could just be a spontaneous,
Absolutely.
Clashing of wills. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why you got to be kind of careful around Valentine's Day. You don't have to walk on eggshells, but like you were saying, like why are we fighting? Like,
yeah,
this is fine.
And that's, I think, brings it back to the point of Taurus testing Mars's staying power.
Yeah. Because
fights break out in relationships. That's a normal part of being in a relationship.
Exactly.
It's just what do you do from there?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I was picking up with the Valentine's Day thing.
Totally.
That's great, yeah.
But you were about to say.
No, that actually, you kind of read my mind and addressed. I was going to say, I was kind of going to throw out the question. Right there. Yeah, I was going to throw out the question. What? Yeah, you're right. You can read it. Yeah. I was going to ask, what do you two think this would, be a good Valentine's Day to do versus what might it be a less favorable?
Oh, like as far as date activities? I mean, Rock climbing? I mean, you could even go out dancing or something physical, but depending on who you are in Italy, you might be a little drained. Fine dining. Taurus loves
I
some
was
fine
thinking
dining.
fine dining, yeah.
Taurus loves the fine dining. So
Fine
maybe
dining
mix
or getting a massage together.
Ooh, spa day. Spa day might be good for your energy levels too.
Yeah.
Mud bath.
The sensual, intimate stuff. Maybe
Yeah.
not the best time to assume that surprising your partner with something new and risky will be successful.
That is a
Good call.
I mean, that's generally a bad idea, but it's an especially bad idea this Valentine's Day.
Keep it safe. Play it safe. If you know what they love to do, honey, I got this really intense thing that you already love to do. Like it's more elaborate than this thing we already like to do together. So if you like going out or cooking, maybe going out for like a really, really nice dinner as opposed to just like chilling, you know.
Yeah, that's great, yeah.
And if you're single, I will say places where you pick up people are easy pickings on Valentine's Day.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Go out. I mean, have a good time for yourself.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely. I mean, even if you're not picking people up, you know, the
energy will be cool to go out and see what's going on. You know, if you're single.
I mean, even
really
if you're, I mean, it is a holiday of Venus in a lot of ways. Doesn't fit very well as a holiday of Venus astrologically.
Right.
Actually,
yeah.
it's a holiday of Venus.
Yeah.
So spending it on giving yourself creature comforts is a great idea.
Absolutely.
So good. Yeah.
And for some people, that is rock
Great point.
climbing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Great point. Yeah.
All right.
Then we have
Next up, so there's a lot of stuff that happens on the 18th and 19th. We've got Chiron entering Aries, and we've got Venus conjunct Saturn, and we've got the full moon in Virgo.
So for our listeners might not be very familiar with Chiron. So who is Chiron? What does it do?
Who is this dude?
yeah.
Yeah, who is this dude?
this
Man,
dude?
horse.
Margaret, how would you describe Chiron? Yeah.
Oh no, no, she passed the ball to us.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
All right. Fine.
Please tell our listeners what this is.
I love Chiron. Chiron. Yeah. Well, I mean, Chiron has long been called the wounded healer, and to such an extent that it can be easy to sort of forget why that's the case. But Chiron is a healer. Chiron mythologically was also the mentor to many of the great heroes.
He was a centaur. So he was half man, half horse.
And he was a son of Saturn, who you know, Saturn, after getting into this nymph sexually, was as Kronos in the Greek, was kind of ashamed when his wife was coming and looking on and about to see them in the act. So he transformed himself into a horse, and it's said that as a result, Chiron was born half horse, half human form. Right? So centaur,
half animal, half man.
Yeah. So, but he ended up learning medicine, learning, you know, healing, and kind of taking on these, as per the kind of painful circumstances of his birth. He took on all of these heroes under his wing and mentored them, and even kind of nurtured and parented them for much of their lives. If we think of like Jason from Jason and the Argonauts, or a lot of the great epic heroes. But he also is known for being very wounded, which is a whole other
His sad end, yeah.
Yeah, a whole other story. And he had as a result of Hercules misfiring a poisonous arrow, this tip of the poisonous arrow landed on Chiron's thigh, and it became an incurable wound because it was a wound of the soul. But at the same time, on the other side, Chiron had this great ability to heal and work with healing powers with people. So on a personal level, what does that mean? We can feel Chiron in terms of where are we wounded? Where are we wounded? And how does wisdom also come from our wound? Or how does wisdom also, or our gift also come from the way that we've suffered?
That last point is, I think, really essential to Chiron, because it's not just that Chiron was the healer.
Yeah.
Chiron in a chart shows mastery.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the figure of Chiron, he could do everything. So what I often think of with Chiron, and this is just a place I've been getting at the past year or so, is that Chiron shows where we gain mastery through our woundedness. Mm-hmm. And what that looks like is everybody's got their thing. Everybody's got like their wound that will not stop bleeding. Say, for example, that you're convinced you're not pretty enough, and that no matter what you do, no matter what people tell you, you are just convinced you are not pretty enough. And so you do everything you can to make up for that perceived lack.
Yeah.
You become a master of dressing well, of using makeup, of picking out quality jewelry. Mm-hmm. All of the accoutrement, all of the bits and pieces of what it takes to create that aesthetic, you go out of your way to master that because of this story, this wound that was going on in your head. I'm not pretty enough. And that is expertise. And then you work with that Chiron wound. You go through it. And eventually you realize that that story you've been telling yourself that entire time was never true in the first place.
Yep.
But especially now that you've done all of this work as a result of that wound, the opposite is true.
Yeah,
and exactly. You free yourself of that, and that's mastery.
And knowing that you have that wound is freeing enough. And going forth from the mastery, you're like, well, I know this about myself, which means I feel like that's a huge part of mastering anything, is being aware of its existence at all. You're like, well, I know I have this thing. Well, I have a very active, Chiron's very active in my natal chart, so like, I know some stuff about work.
Absolutely.
And but it's really beautiful when you finally are just like, oh, this problem wasn't real, but I've figured out how to solve this problem that wasn't even there. So it's almost like having like a layer of protective armor of just knowledge.
But it's also a wound that never goes away completely.
Right.
Healing is not a linear process. Healing is not, you know, there's some things where you spend your entire life working on them, and then, you know, a whole bunch of things go wrong in one day, and then it's right back where you were.
Right.
You get back on the horse, or you get right back on the centaur. That's what the Chiron wound is.
Mm-hmm. I love the way both of you just put that. Yeah, that's great. If you look at some of the contemporary work that's been done around the acorn myth, the notion that each person, each soul comes into a human body with a daimon of some sort, or with a sense of genius, basically, that a genius that informs the human body through the human soul, the soul in the human body through life. An animated spirit, exactly. That some of the work that's been done around this goes into stories of how a sense of one's calling is discovered, and how, you know, and it happens differently for different people. But talking about, I forget who one of these stories was about, but just stories such as when a certain very prominent writer was all his teachers in third grade said that he couldn't read and write, and that he was behind all of the other students. And then it turns out in his 30s or whatever, in his adulthood, he becomes a very prominent writer. Or we have different kinds of examples, or I forget, some famous athlete who everyone thought he couldn't play sports when he was a kid. And then it's like, so the work that's been done on these cases has talked about, like, well, of course, if you look at it from the perspective of the guiding, as Arthur just said, animated spirit, and also, as you said earlier, the wound that won't stop bleeding, it's like the animating spirit guides us, but also upsets us. And also kind of, it can be a taskmaster sometimes. It's not like this sort of gentle, soft, cuddly animating spirit, right? So there's a certain perspective that says, of course, that person had trouble reading and writing in third grade.
Right.
It's because they were destined. It's because part of their destiny was becoming a great writer, and they were already dealing with the burden of that from when they were very young. So it kind of flips the script a little bit on what our
feel
abilities
compelled,
are.
like if we suffer some sort of injustice, like maybe we didn't get enough affection that we desired when we were little or whatever, you grow up and you're like, I want to help people the way that I was never helped.
Right.
Like I can provide this comfort because I myself have directly experienced this wound. And I know it'll never go away, but helping other people avoid the pain of that can almost be the healing.
Right.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily about healing others. For a lot, I mean, for folks in our social circles, it often is. But like for some person, it could be like, let's talk about tourists some more. Like the food at home was growing up was just awful. Just like they never could stand their family's cooking. And so they become an expert chef, and they never cook for anyone else. They just cook for themselves.
Right.
But they're really good at cooking.
But it's remedying a wound, knowing it'll never go away, but almost like getting on top of it and standing on top of it. Being like, it's here, but it's also lifting me up higher than I was before.
Yes.
If you think of it as a rock kind of crushing you, you get out from under it and then you stand on it. The rock's not going to go away, but it's elevating you in its existence.
Yeah.
But as far as it going into Aries,
so a lot of this has to do with I was just thinking that a lot of this has to do with Chiron in the natal chart and how you work with your individual Chiron. But if you look at Chiron transiting, where's Chiron going on? What part of the sky is Chiron going through at a given moment? You're looking at sort of where this story on a collective level. Where are we all wounded in the nature of this sign? Where is our collective trauma?
And it's important to note that it's going from Pisces to Aries, which is kind of a special leap.
Well, it briefly dipped into Aries for a little while. I want to say last summer. I don't have the dates off the top of my head. Before going back into Pisces, and it's just been finishing up the last bit of the Pisces story. Which has been going on for like 8 years now. Chiron's orbit is sort of diagonal to the planets. It's not a planet, it's called a centaur. That's the name of the object. And it sort of goes at a diagonal, so because of that, it'll spend anywhere from 2 to 8 years in a sign. And Pisces is one of the ones that spends a really long time in. So just a lot of what we've been dealing with on our collective wounded level is, this sort of infinite. It's, Pisces wound to me is just everything is just so much. It's all just so much. Everything is everything all at once, all over.
Overwhelming.
Yes, overwhelming.
Overwhelming, exactly.
Drowning. Almost a little
Drowning.
bit.
Yeah, well, And I mean, that's the consequence of the trouble with boundaries you find with Pisces. It's just everything is coming in all at once.
Or the fog. It's foggy.
Yeah, foggy.
And there's also this question of the ideal, of the belief, of the dream, of the vision, because you do have the traditional ruler of Jupiter for Pisces. So it's like, what do we all believe? Everything's going on all the time, all at once. We've seen that a lot. I mean, we've absolutely seen, like, in this collective sense of everything is happening all at once and it just hurts so much.
Yeah.
That's been the culture.
For a long time. I mean, we're all...
Past couple of years,
We're all around the same age, too, so our age group is feeling it in a specific way. It's interesting.
Yeah, we've the Pluto and Scorpio generation is really short end of the stick.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure is.
The Pluto,
that's a whole episode.
We're the ones who got strong. Yeah, that is a whole episode.
It is, yeah.
But now this shift is into Aries, so it's like, oh my God, it goes from, oh my God, everything is all at once to, I'm gonna do something about it.
Yeah, right.
Like when Chiron was last in Aries in the 60s, you had a lot of really violent protests. And this is a long transit. This is, I think, another 6, 7, 8 years of Chiron in Aries. But now we're just getting introduced to it of like, of claiming our rage.
Yeah.
And that's, in some ways, that's a very destructive thing. And on another way, from another angle, there's a lot of people who have never been given permission to claim their rage.
Exactly.
Who are suddenly feeling like, oh, I have permission to be angry.
Yeah.
And that's big.
It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah.
Chiron in Aries can be very much like woundedness around your anger, dealing with the fact that you feel you didn't have a right to be angry. And then you're like, I have a right to be angry. Because that's part of the human experience.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know? And part of it is anger, and part of it is just that Mars-ruled Aries of that passion, that will, that, you know, I'm going to go, I'm going to move, I'm going to get shit done.
And Chiron chills out as far as in space locale, kind of between Saturn and Uranus.
Yeah.
So
it goes, but yeah.
So it's kind of hanging out between this planet of structure and boundaries and this planet of suddenness.
Yeah, the authority who limits and the revolutionary who defies those limits.
Yeah. So Chiron brings that into the mix, and especially with, was it immediately the next day or was it the same day with Venus?
Yeah, Chiron enters Aries on the 18th, and Venus conjoins Saturn on the 18th as well.
So that's a whole nother layer of sudden, I don't want to say suddenness, but if Chiron has a hybridization of Saturnian and Uranian energy, and Saturn is going to aspect Venus on the same day.
Yeah.
You know, obviously they're not the same planet, but it's a coloring, you know, it's a hue.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
And furthermore,
we have to take note of that. Yeah.
Right. Yes. And also, and to add to that, Margaret, also Chiron in Aries goes back to, that points to Mars in Taurus, which points to Venus in Capricorn, which goes to which goes to Saturn. So in other words, Venus and Saturn are also informing in a certain way, like in a final sense, like Venus and Saturn are informing Chiron's move into
absolutely
Aries.
Yeah, with the rulership and whatnot.
Yeah.
So
what might the Venus conjunction mean on its own, and then what would it mean in relation to Chiron?
Well, there's like 4 events going on in these 2 days.
Right. So we just talked about Chiron entering Aries, and now we're talking about Venus conjoining Saturn.
Well, Venus conjoining Saturn is sort of I remember, so I was at UAC last year, the United Astrology Conference. That's where Margaret and I met. Woo! It was a great time. Yeah. If you really love astrology, go to an astrology conference.
Check it out.
They're amazing.
It's amazing.
There's scholarships available and whatnot. But anyway, during UAC there was a Venus-Saturn opposition, and on the night of the Venus-Saturn opposition, they held a sort of like a fancy ball / auction that was supposed to be 20s themed and had a live jazz band, and there was no band. I forget if they didn't show up or if they left after 20 minutes to go to another gig, or it was something like that. Mm-hmm. But then what you had was all of these people standing around ready for a fancy party, and there was no music.
Right.
Saturn.
Yeah.
Venus wants to be fun and pleasurable and relate, and Saturn says no to things.
Yeah.
Like no.
Right.
No. Saturn is
no.
Saturn.
So what might the conjunction?
Oh God, I need to use that more often.
What might the conjunction mean as opposed to the opposition of that time?
It's still so. The opposition is more of a conflict to it, whereas it's like the opposition is like the no is coming from externally. Whereas with the conjunction, the no is just there. Like the wall is just there. The barrier is just there. And they're just sort of vibrating on the same frequency. Because when you've got a conjunction, you've got 2 planets that are the exact same point in the sky. So they're both pinging the same stuff and being pinged by the same stuff. So they're similar in that it's both running into a bit of a brick wall. And after the 18th, when Venus gets past Saturn and is starting to separate, then it'll be a little bit easier to be like to have some relief and it'll be easier to have fun, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The pleasure things will be easier.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Venus conjunct Saturn, it's easy to feel a lot of dictatorial energy around pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or guilt over pleasure.
Guilt. Yeah.
Guilt, shame.
Yeah.
You know, feeling like you're not supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that gets easier after the 18th.
Yeah.
Also around that time, we've got Mercury conjunct Neptune, which happens on either the 18th or the 19th, depending on your time zone.
Mm-hmm.
Here in New York, and I think in Milwaukee too, it happens on the Mercury conjunct Neptune is on the 19th, but on like California or whatever, it's on the 18th.
Right.
So you'll feel it both days. Mercury in hard aspect to Neptune, whatever hard aspect, it's like a little small period of a Mercury retrograde.
Yeah, brief.
You know,
brief
brief for a couple of days. And
Yeah.
Mercury will be going retrograde through Pisces and passing over Neptune again in March.
Well,
So
it's
you
kind of a
get-
double whammy because of Pisces. You know, you got the
Exactly.
Pisces energy and then
Yeah.
Neptune as well.
Mars's Mercury retrograde is going to be challenging in a lot of ways. So I don't think it's going to be destructive. I think it's just going to be a lot of, because Jupiter's so connected to it, and we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but it's relevant. It's going to be like a benign trickster with mishaps rather than misfortunes.
Right.
A little bit of a preview around that on the 18th, 19th.
Mm-hmm.
Mishaps, miscommunications.
Shakespearean mishaps.
Don't buy a new laptop then.
Yeah.
You know, there's just lots of little things going wrong. Dropping your phone.
Yeah, dropping your phone.
I write daily astro weather things on Twitter and Instagram, and one of them a few days ago was don't drop your phone, and that happened to Nate.
It happened to me. I read the astro weather afterwards.
Damn it.
Yeah. Sorry, sometimes I don't get them out until like noon.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, but that's just a little of that going on with all this cluster on the 18th, 19th, and the full moon in Virgo.
Yeah.
Let's bring that up.
On the 19th.
On the 19th. So it'll be most visible during the evening of the 18th. So between like around the end of the year and the start of the year, you have a bunch of the new moons and full moons are all at about the same degree in a row. So what we've been dealing with the past few months has been these full moons right at 0 degrees of the sign.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got the sun at 0 degrees of Pisces on the 19th and the moon at 0 Virgo.
Mm-hmm.
It's at 10:53 a.m. in New York,
Mm-hmm.
is when it's exact. So looking at this, you've got a pretty close trine between the sun and the moon here and Mars-Uranus. And you've also got an exact inconjunct between the sun, moon, and Chiron.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this stuff we've been talking about with Mars-Uranus and Mars and Taurus and all the stuff we've been talking about with Chiron and Aries is just going to get really activated around the 18th, 19th as well.
Well,
Right. And Chiron is almost at the midpoint between Sun and Mars, but Mars
yeah.
is free. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Outletting.
Right.
You know, it's in spite of that, like I think this is one of the better it's one of the better full moons. You know, it's better that like anytime everybody likes to charge their crystals under the full moon. Never do that during a lunar eclipse.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you happen to charge your crystals during the blood moon in January, which is blood moon just means lunar eclipse, careful around those crystals. They tend to pick up. I mean, so clean them out before this next full moon. And this one is not super wonderful, amazing, but totally doable, totally workable if you're trying to charge any magical objects under the moon.
That's a good call, yeah.
It's doable.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So this is just on top of everything else going on these couple of days. The full moon just adds a lot of juice and energy to everything. You know, it's hard to sleep on a full moon, at least for me. I don't know about you guys.
Oh,
when the moon is
very hard.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a Marsy kind of guy, so I'll probably have an easier time sleeping that time generally. But I don't know. But wait, that reminds me. So all of the difficulty sleeping, I've been hearing so many reports of for January. Once we get into like middle of February, especially once we've got Mars and Taurus, then there's a lot less fire in the sky, you know?
Right.
Like after the middle of the month, the second half of the month, it's just like, oh my God, I can finally rest.
Right.
Yes.
Although there's so much going on around the 18th, 19th. Just watch the news, especially around those couple of days. There's just going to be so much going on. I mean, there's always so much going on, but bigger deals around those couple of days.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm like looking at this chart as we're talking and still just wrapping my brain around it, because there's so much, you know, everything you just said. And also it's like there's these kind of definite mixed messages happening, mixed qualities. There's this kind of like the Mercury Neptune thing we were talking about earlier is still sort of active. There's the dreamy, sort of slightly confused, slightly foggy sense. But then there's also this trine with Mars. So there's this kind of activation happening.
There's a strong activation, but the activity is slow.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Slow and steady.
Yeah. Strong activation, strong emotion, as is typical for full moons. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Like pushing a boulder.
Yeah.
Like you give her the most in the beginning, but it's still a slow act. You know?
Pushing like a slippery boulder. Yeah.
Yeah.
One must imagine Sisyphus naked.
Yeah.
Wait, no,
Oh, perfect.
Like having water in his shoes or something.
Oh,
yeah.
pushing it through molasses. Being covered in molasses.
I don't think Taurus is that slow. No, Taurus isn't. Taurus is slow in a mostly a positive way.
Yeah.
I just like the imagery of bathing in molasses.
Okay, the imagery of yes, one must imagine.
Let us Taurians have our imagery.
Yeah, come on, man.
I just don't want you Taurians to be too hard on yourselves either. But enjoy your molasses bath.
Molasses is soft and sticky on ourselves.
Just whatever floats your rubber duck.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
All right. And finally, oh man, finally on the 22nd, we've got Venus conjunct Pluto.
Oofda.
Yeah, so that's a fun one. So when you've got Venus conjunct Pluto, you've got a lot of the sexuality turned into dark fantasy or BDSM or sort of or obsessive. Venus Pluto can get very, very, very attached because Venus wants what it wants. Venus in some ways rules the desire principle.
Mm-hmm.
So obsessive desire you often find around Venus Pluto aspects.
In natally or transit or
natally
both, I'm assuming.
Especially natally. So you're just going to be up like Venus, like on the 22nd, you just might find yourself looking up your ex's Facebook at 2 a.m. and not know why. Like what's come over you.
Yeah.
If someone
the grief around that, exactly, because all of the difficult emotions and pain of relationships as well is really emphasized there.
So if someone, for example, had Venus conjunct Pluto in their own chart, and then this conjunction happened,
well, what
for listeners who might not know as much, like what would it do to them? for example.
Well, what you've got, anytime a transiting aspect is similar to an aspect in your natal chart, you've got what's called natal excitation, where that part of your life or your personality just gets pinged, just gets activated. So with Venus Pluto, with that obsessive desire, when you've got that natally, you're often prone to you're not necessarily prone to obsessively desiring others. A lot of the time, what that looks like is others are just obsessed with you, and you don't know why.
Okay.
But that pattern gets activated. You know,
Yes.
like you might not be the one looking up your ex's Facebook at 2 a.m., but you might find that your ex has liked your Instagram, has been looking at your Instagram story.
Right.
Or that you get really insecurely attached with the relationship you're in. You know?
Yeah.
Or if it's not about relationships at all, if it's just about what you want and your desire and your sense of pleasure, dealing with all of the shame and the pain around that. Because our society does not give people a lot of room to desire freely. You know, this is a culture, especially in the United States, that shames people for wanting.
Yeah.
So,
But drives us to want as well, which is a confusing
and drives
enough.
us to want as well.
Yeah,
yeah,
we're told to want, but then we're punished when we want. You know,
and so much of the growth process for a lot of people is learning how to want. Because a lot of how we were taught how to want was from commercials.
Yeah.
And that's not authentic.
How to approach desire. Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm seeing, because the full moon chart's still up in the screen share. I'm just kind of looking now though, and I see that conjunction of Venus Pluto will meet the south node.
Oh yeah. Well, Pluto's really close to the south node. Yeah. So
very close. Yeah, this conjunction also is in the third decan of Capricorn.
Yeah.
And
I just looked it up because I was pronouncing it decan for the longest time.
It's decan, isn't it?
It's decan.
Is it decan? Oh,
yeah.
Decan?
There's an astrologer who I love dearly who pronounces it decant.
Decant. Yeah.
And I love her dearly, so I won't name who she is.
Okay.
Well, I studied decant.
If you look at
decant the decan.
Yeah.
It's decan.
If you look at the some of the fixed stars around there, a lot of it has to do with
decan for the listeners. So each sign is divided up. So each sign is 30 degrees.
Yeah.
Because 12 signs, 360 degrees in a circle, basic geometry. If you remember that from school, I don't blame you if you don't. But each sign is 30 degrees, and those 30 degrees are divided into 3 sets of 10 degrees, which are called the decans, D-E-C-A-N.
Yeah.
And so you were saying about Venus Pluto in the third decan.
Right. That this decan happens to be this decan of Capricorn.
Korean decan.
The what?
It would be the Virgoian decan.
Yeah, but I've looked up some of the fixed star symbolism around this one, and the fixed stars, I don't recall which ones or what they're called, but they have to do with actually journeys to the underworld, and one of them cites Orpheus as an example. So Orpheus going down to recover Eurydice, his lover. And being told not to look back, and so that whole myth of, it's interesting you said you used the example of looking at your ex's Facebook profile, because there's this sense of a kind of grief-ridden journey but also with an artistic component. So it's not it's not all gloom and doom. It's like there's also.
It's the beauty and the pain. I mean, if you want to...
Beauty and the pain.
Yeah, it's a great aspect. Venus conjunct Pluto is a great transit for making, like, art that touches into a deep, authentic, emotional place.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So in this decan, even more, we could say that's even more heightened in this case. Yeah.
And because of the South Node conjunction, I would say it's an excellent time to look back, evaluate, and release.
Yeah, shedding a lot of those patterns around, shame around desire.
Yeah.
but also like desire that gets twisted and brought to an unnecessary extreme.
Right.
One thing I will say, so generally I would say this aspect would be most active because it's Venus involved for people with major planets in Taurus and Libra. Now that I'm looking at the chart, the full chart, so the moon is exactly square to that aspect, to that Venus-Pluto conjunction, because the conjunction's right there at 22 Capricorn, and then you've got the moon at 22 Libra, and Mercury is also pretty closely sextiling at 21 Pisces. So there's a lot of focus and emphasis that gets placed on that conjunction right as it occurs in the evening of February 22nd. So it's going to be biggest in terms of themes for people with natal Venus-Pluto aspects, with major planets in Sun, Moon, Rising in particular in Taurus and Libra. But it's just going to be a lot more collective in terms of how many people are feeling it, because it's getting the ping from the moon in Libra and the ping from Mercury in Pisces.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Yeah.
Quite an active month we got going on.
Oh yeah,
Quite an active month.
yeah. This is an interesting year. We live in interesting times. But I think that'll just about do it.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Where can folks find us if they want to follow our social media and learn more about us? Or
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I have a personal Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm not very Twitter active. It's more of Arthur's wheelhouse than mine.
yeah,
I also have my personal business is Skyroots Astrology. So I have a website and an Instagram for that.
skyroootsastrology.com
Yes.
and on Instagram.
And on Instagram. I'm more active personally than I am astrologically, just as a chatterbox, but I post on my personal Facebook a lot about astrology as well. So find me in either place. I'm going to try to be more Twitter active, but I can't make any promises. I'm not very good at Twitter. I don't know why.
Yeah. What about you?
I'm not on Twitter, but I've got an astrology Instagram handle, Mythopoetic Astrology, and I've got my personal Facebook page and also Mythopoetic Astrology on Facebook.
All right. And your website?
Website is under construction, so that's not going to be the best place to reach me. Yeah.
All right. So I am on Twitter at Lip and Bone. I am on Instagram at Readings by Arthur. You can find me online. My website is arthurlipp.bonewits.com. The spelling will be in the show description. It's ArthurLippBonewits.com. I will also, as this episode goes live, be setting up official accounts for Bird's Eye Astrology. So you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Bird's Eye Astro and birdseyeastrology.com. And we're on Patreon at Bird's Eye Astrology. Very simple, same name everywhere. But Twitter limits the number of characters in your handle, so that's just Bird's Eye Astro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Such is life.
And most of the Bird's Eye Astro tweeting will be me.
Yes. Absolutely yes.
All right. Well, I think that just about does it.
All right. Excellent.
All right.
Well, thank you all for listening. It was wonderful having you. I mean, it was wonderful having, Arthur and Nate and talking all today, but we love sharing with you, and we hope you continue listening in the future because we have a lot to say and a lot of knowledge to share.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed this show, leave us some feedback, leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from, and you can support us on Patreon.
All right. Well, until next time.
Until next time.